The moment the silence broke, it wasn't with a sob or a prayer, but with the sharp intake of breath from 200 people standing in the muddy grass. I was staring at the mahogany casket, the wood polished to a shine that hurt my swollen eyes, ready to throw the first handful of dirt onto the woman who had taught me how to walk, how to love, and how to survive a broken heart. I was 27, but in that moment, standing at the edge of the abyss that was my mother's grave, I felt like a lost child of 5. And then he moved. Mark didn't reach for my shoulder to comfort me. He didn't hand me a tissue. He stepped between me and my mother's final resting place. The wet grass squelched as he dropped to one knee. The sound was distinct, alien, wrong. It sliced through the sacred heaviness of the cemetery. He pulled a black velvet box from his jacket pocket, the same jacket he had worn to the hospital the night she died, and snapped it open. A diamond sat there, catching the gray, filtered light of the overcast afternoon. "Valentina!" he said, his voice projecting, not whispering, ensuring that every cousin, every neighbor, every old friend from my mother's bingo group could hear him. "I know she's watching us right now. I know this is what she would have wanted more than anything. Let's turn this day of sorrow into a day of hope." The crowd gasped. A collective, sickening "ah" rippled through the mourners like a wave. They saw romance. They saw a hero saving a damsel from her grief. But I saw a thief. I looked down at him, and I didn't feel love. I felt bile rising in my throat. I felt the weight of 200 expectant stares pressing against my spine, forcing me to nod, forcing my lips to form a word that tasted like ash. But wait. Before I tell you how that ring felt like a shackle the moment it slid onto my finger, and before I tell you about the cold, calculating truth I discovered 3 days later that turned my sadness into a rage hot enough to burn cities, let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you about the morning the world ended, and how he was already planning his performance. It started in the silence of the house at 6 a.m. The house had always smelled of lavender and toasted bread when Mom was alive. Now it smelled of stale flowers and the industrial cleaner from the hospice equipment we hadn't returned yet. I was sitting on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at my black dress hanging on the closet door. It looked like a shadow waiting to swallow me. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't clasp the gold locket my mother had given me for my 16th birthday. It was the only jewelry I wanted to wear today. Just as I was about to give up and let the tears ruin the makeup I hadn't even applied yet, Mark walked in. He looked impeccable. Too impeccable. His hair was gelled, his suit was pressed sharp enough to cut skin, and he had a vitality about him that felt disrespectful in a house heavy with death. He didn't look like a man mourning the woman who had welcomed him into her home for 3 years. He looked like a man preparing for a business presentation. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, his voice smooth, practical. He took the locket from my trembling fingers. His hands were warm, dry, steady. He fastened the clasp at the nape of my neck, his fingers lingering there a moment too long. "You need to pull it together, Val. People will be arriving soon." "I can't breathe, Mark," I whispered, turning to look at him, searching for a mirror of my own devastation in his eyes. "I don't think I can walk down that aisle." He placed his hands on my shoulders and squeezed. It wasn't a hug, it was a brace. "You can, and you will. I've organized everything. The cars are ready, the reception at the hall is set up. I spoke to the priest this morning to ensure the eulogy time slot is extended. I've got you. Just trust me." Memorable. That word struck me as odd, drifting in the fog of my brain. Why would we want a funeral to be memorable for anything other than the goodbye? But I dismissed it. I was too weak to fight, too hollowed out by the last 6 months of chemotherapy and late-night vigils to question him. I leaned my forehead against his chest, smelling his expensive cologne, a new scent, one I hadn't smelled on him before. "Thank you," I sobbed into his lapel. "I know," he said, and he kissed the top of my head. "Go get dressed. You need to look beautiful today." The drive to the church was a blur of gray skies and rain streaking against the window. I sat in the back of the limousine, clutching Mom's old rosary beads so tight they left red indentations in my palm. Mark sat opposite me, checking his watch every 3 minutes. He was tapping his foot. At the time, I thought it was nervousness, perhaps anxiety on my behalf. Now I know it was the adrenaline of a stage director waiting for the curtain to rise. He asked the driver, his voice sharp. "Yes, sir. We'll arrive 5 minutes early," the driver replied, eyeing me with pity in the rearview mirror. Mark nodded, satisfied, and reached across to pat my knee. "Almost there, Val. Just stick to the script. You mourn, I handle the rest." I asked, my voice cracking, "Figure of speech, honey. Just—" When we walked into the church, the air was thick with incense and the murmurs of 200 people. It was a massive turnout. My mother was a teacher for 30 years. She had touched generations. There were former students, neighbors who remembered when she planted the oak tree in the front yard, family members we hadn't seen in a decade. As I walked down the center aisle, my legs felt like lead. Every face I passed was a mirror reflecting my own loss. Aunt Rosa was sobbing into a handkerchief in the second pew. Mr. Henderson, the grouchy neighbor, was wiping his eyes. I reached the front and saw the casket. It was closed, covered in a spray of white lilies, her favorite. I collapsed into the front pew, the wood hard and unforgiving. Mark sat next to me, but he didn't sit still. He was scanning the room, nodding at people, checking the placement of the microphone. He seemed energized by the crowd. The service was beautiful and excruciating. The priest spoke of Mom's kindness, her laughter, her famous apple pie. I cried until my ribs ached, until there was no water left in my body, just a dry, heaving sorrow. Through it all, Mark held my hand, but his grip was possessive, firm. Whenever I leaned too far forward in my grief, he would pull me back up, straightening my posture. "Sit up," he whispered in my ear. Then came the procession to the cemetery. The rain had stopped, leaving the world damp and cold. We gathered around the open grave. The smell of wet earth is something you never forget. It smells like finality. The priest said the final prayers, his voice droning on, fighting against the wind rustling the cemetery trees. "Dust to dust," the priest intoned. It was time. People shifted, preparing to offer their condolences and leave. This was the moment of closure. This was the moment I was supposed to say goodbye to the woman who had knit my soul together. Mark stepped forward. He wasn't supposed to speak here. The speeches were done. I reached out to tug his sleeve, confused. I whispered. He ignored me. He turned to face the crowd, his back to the open grave, effectively blocking my view of my mother's casket. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Friends, family," Mark began, his voice booming. He had a preacher's cadence, a practiced solemnity. "We are all here today with heavy hearts. We have lost a saint." He paused for effect. I frowned. He hadn't. He had visited, sure, but he was always on his phone, always taking a call in the hallway while I changed her sheets or fed her ice chips. Mark continued, looking directly at my weeping aunts, then turning his gaze to me. She told me that her biggest fear wasn't dying. It was leaving her Valentina alone. My breath caught. It felt like he was using her ghost as a ventriloquist dummy. Mom had never said that. She had told me, "You are strong, Valentina." Mark walked towards me. The crowd parted, creating a small circle around us, right there on the muddy grass. I made a promise to her, right before she passed. He lied. I knew he lied. He wasn't even in the room when she took her last breath. I was alone with her. He reached into his pocket. The air shifted. The atmosphere went from somber to confused, then to electrified. "No," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. My brain couldn't process it. Not here, not now, not over her body. He dropped to one knee. That brings us back to the edge of the abyss. The world narrowed down to the black velvet box and the look in his eyes. It wasn't love, it was triumph. He looked like he had just closed a deal. "Valentina," he said again, louder this time, ensuring the people in the back row heard. The manipulation was so sharp, so precise, it felt like a physical blow. If I said no, I wasn't just rejecting him, I was rejecting my dead mother's wish in front of everyone she knew. I would be the ungrateful daughter causing a scene at a funeral. I would be the villain. I looked at Aunt Rosa. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and adoration. "Oh, bless him," I heard someone whisper. "How romantic," said another. They didn't see the trap. They only saw the theater. I looked down at Mark. He was smiling, a tight, confident smile. He knew he had me. He knew I was too polite, too broken, and too kind to humiliate him in front of 200 people. He was banking on my grief, making me pliable. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to scream. I wanted to kick the box out of his hand and yell that he was desecrating holy ground. But the pressure was a physical weight, heavy as the dirt waiting to cover the casket. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. His smile faltered just a fraction, his eyes narrowing slightly, a warning. "Don't you dare embarrass me." Tears streamed down my face, hot and angry, but the crowd interpreted them as tears of joy. "Yes," I choked out. It was a whisper, a surrender. Someone shouted from the back, good-naturedly. "Yes," I said louder, my voice trembling with a vibration that felt like cracking glass. Mark stood up, slid the ring onto my finger, it was loose, spinning on my cold skin, and pulled me into a kiss. I didn't kiss him back. I stood there, stiff as a corpse, while the cemetery erupted in applause. Clapping. People were clapping at a funeral. The sound was grotesque, percussive slaps that drowned out the wind in the trees. He pulled away and hugged me, burying his face in my neck. "I told you I'd make it memorable," he whispered against my skin. I looked over his shoulder at the open grave. The lilies on the casket seemed to wilt under the noise. I felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by him, but by myself. I had let him turn my mother's goodbye into his engagement party. People swarmed us immediately. The line for condolences turned into a receiving line for congratulations. Cousin Sophia squealed, grabbing my hand. "Oh my God, Valentina, it's huge!" "Your mother is smiling down right now," Mrs. Gable said, patting my cheek with a damp tissue. "Congratulations, sweetheart," Aunt Rosa sobbed, hugging me so hard I couldn't breathe, from sorrow to joy. I smiled. I had to. It was a rictus of a smile, a mask plastered onto my face. "Thank you," I said, over and over again. Mark was in his element. He was shaking hands, accepting backslaps from the men. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, I heard him tell my uncle. I just knew today was the day. Spur of the moment. The ring on my finger felt heavy, cold, and sharp. It didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a receipt for a transaction I hadn't agreed to. We eventually moved to the wake at the parish hall. I moved through the room like a ghost in my own life. Mark barely left my side, his arm draped possessively around my waist, his fingers digging into my hip whenever I stopped smiling. He was the grieving son-in-law, the hero, the rock. "You did great," he muttered to me as we finally walked to the car hours later. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the parking lot. Everyone is talking about it. I stopped at the car door, looking at him, really looking at him. The mask slipped for a second. He rolled his eyes, unlocking the car. "Don't be dramatic, Val. I created a moment. I gave people something to smile about. You should be thanking me," I repeated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Get in the car," he said, his tone dismissing me. "We have a lot of planning to do." I got in the car. I looked down at the diamond glittering in the dashboard lights. It was beautiful, objectively. But as we drove away from the place where my mother lay in the dark earth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left more than just her behind. I had left my freedom there, too. I didn't know then that the ring was a lie. I didn't know that 3 days later, while looking for a tax document in his home office, I would find a crumpled piece of paper that would unravel everything. I didn't know that he hadn't bought the ring months ago, saving up for the perfect moment, as he would later claim to my family. But sitting there in the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur through my tears, I knew one thing. I was engaged to a man who saw my pain as a prop, and the applause from the cemetery was still ringing in my ears, louder than my own thoughts. The silence of the house that night was louder than the applause at the cemetery. Mark had fallen asleep almost immediately, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, the sleep of a man with a clear conscience and a satisfied ego. I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling where the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows through the blinds. The ring was on the nightstand. I had taken it off the second we entered the bedroom, claiming my fingers were swollen from the crying and the salt, but the truth was that I couldn't bear the weight of it. It sat there, glittering in the semi-darkness, a cold, hard eye watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mud on Mark's knee and the dirt on my mother's casket. They were inextricably linked now. My grief had been colonized. The next 2 days were a blur of administrative agony that accompanies death. People think funerals are the end, but they are just the beginning of the paperwork. There were bank accounts to close, death certificates to photocopy, and a lifetime of belongings to sort through. I moved through it all like a sleepwalker, my body present, but my spirit hovering somewhere near the ceiling, unable to fully inhabit a world without my mother. Mark, however, was vibrant. He was on the phone constantly. Not with the lawyer for the estate, but with caterers, with his mother. "Yes, Mom, I know," I heard him saying from the kitchen while I was trying to sort through Mom's medicine cabinet, weeping silently over a bottle of unfinished cough syrup. "We're thinking a spring wedding, no point in waiting. Life is short, right? That's the lesson here." He walked into the bathroom, phone pressed to his shoulder, holding a mug of coffee. He looked at me, sitting on the cold tile floor, surrounded by pill bottles, and frowned. Not a frown of sympathy, but of impatience. "Val, honey, my mom wants to know if you prefer roses or peonies." I looked up at him, my eyes burning. "Mark, we just buried my mother 48 hours ago. I am sitting on her bathroom floor throwing away her pain medication." He sighed, a long, exaggerated exhalation that signaled he was dealing with a difficult child. He covered the microphone of his phone. "You need to stop wallowing, Valentina. It's unhealthy. You're dwelling in the dark when you should be looking toward the light. We have a future to plan, I snapped, the anger flaring up sudden and hot. She's dead, Mark. She's not on vacation. Okay, he said, holding up a hand in surrender, backing out of the room. I'll tell her peonies. He didn't listen. He never listened. He just overwrote my reality with the version that suited him best. The breaking point came on the morning of the third day. It was a Tuesday. The house was cold because the heating system was acting up, something Mom usually knew how to fix with a specific jiggle of the thermostat, a trick she took to the grave. I was looking for the folder containing the deed to the house. The lawyer needed it, and I knew Mark had taken a pile of papers into his home office for safekeeping the night she died. Mark was at work. He had left whistling. I entered his office. It was a room I rarely went into. Mark was territorial about his space. It smelled of leather and stale coffee. His desk was a chaotic landscape of files, sticky notes, and tech gadgets. I started shifting through the papers, looking for the blue folder with the deed. I found unpaid electricity bills, a few speeding tickets he hadn't told me about, and a stack of business cards. I opened the top drawer of his desk, hoping he had filed the deed away. It wasn't there. I checked the second drawer. Nothing. Frustrated, I looked at the wastebasket in the corner. It was overflowing. Mark never emptied his own trash. He left it until it spilled over, waiting for the cleaning fairy, me, to deal with it. A flash of blue caught my eye near the top of the trash heap. It looked like the corner of the deed folder. I knelt down and reached into the bin, pulling aside a crushed soda can and a handful of crumpled receipts. It wasn't the deed. It was just a flyer for a car wash. But as I pulled my hand back, a piece of thermal paper stuck to my finger, damp from the soda can. I peeled it off, intending to flick it back into the trash, but something about the logo at the top caught my attention. L&J Jewelers. My heart gave a strange syncopated thump. This was the receipt for the ring. I smoothed the crumpled paper out on the floor, my hands trembling. Mark had told everyone, my aunts, his parents, the neighbors at the wake, that he had been planning this for 6 months. He had told a tearful story to my cousin Sophia about how he had hidden the ring in his sock drawer, waiting for the perfect moment, and that when Mom died, he knew he had to step up. It was a beautiful story. It made him sound devoted, thoughtful, patient. I looked at the date on the receipt. October 14th. The funeral was October 14th. I blinked. Sure, I was misreading it. Maybe it was the date the transaction cleared? No. The timestamp was right there, printed in black ink that was already starting to fade. 9:15 a.m. A cold wave washed over me, starting at my scalp and rushing down to my toes. The funeral service began at 11 a.m. We had left the house at 10 a.m. My mind raced back to that morning. I remembered sitting on my bed, paralyzed by grief, unable to clasp my locket. I remembered Mark walking in, looking impeccable, smelling of the outdoors and cold air, not the shower. He had told me he went out to get extra coffee and donuts for the cousins early that morning. He hadn't gone for coffee. He had gone to the jewelry store at the mall. He had walked into a store less than 2 hours before my mother's funeral, pointed at a diamond, paid for it, and put it in his pocket. It wasn't a 6-month plan. It wasn't a thoughtful gesture. It was an impulse purchase, a prop. I read further down the receipt. 5-carat solitaire. Clearance section. No returns, final sale. Clearance. He had bought a non-refundable clearance ring on the morning of my mother's burial, so he could propose over her corpse. A sound escaped my throat, a ragged, animal noise that was half laugh, half sob. The audacity of it was suffocating. He hadn't bought the ring because he wanted to marry me. He bought it because he saw an opportunity. He saw a captive audience of 200 emotional people. He saw a stage. He realized that if he walked into that church as just the boyfriend, he was a supporting character. But if he walked out as the fiancé who saved the grieving daughter, he was the star. He had used my mother's death as a backdrop for his ego. He had weaponized my grief to make himself look like a hero. I sat there on the floor of his office, the receipt shaking in my hand. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. The bile rose in my throat, tasting of betrayal. I looked at the ring finger of my left hand. I wasn't wearing the diamond, but I could feel the phantom weight of it, the ghost of the shackle. Everything made sense now. The way he checked his watch in the limo, he wasn't nervous. He was calculating if he had enough time to pull off the stunt, the script he mentioned to the driver. The way he positioned himself between me and the grave, blocking my view of my own mother so the crowd could see him better. He had stolen the last moment I had with her. I didn't remember saying goodbye to Mom. I didn't remember the sound of the earth hitting the casket. I only remembered his voice, his speech, his performance. He had taken the most sacred, painful moment of my life and turned it into content for his social media. I stood up, my legs wobbly. I walked over to the desk and picked up a framed photo of us from last Christmas. We looked happy. I looked at his smile, the same confident, tight smile he had worn at the cemetery. It was the smile of a predator who knows the prey isn't running. "You didn't do it for her," I whispered to the empty room. The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a lover's quarrel. It was a cold, glacial fury. It was the kind of rage that burns cities down, but quietly, starting from the foundations. I heard the front door open downstairs. "Val? Honey?" Mark's voice floated up the stairs, cheerful, oblivious. "I picked up some Chinese food, and guess what? My mom booked the country club for the engagement dinner." I froze. I looked at the receipt in my hand. I wanted to run downstairs and shove it down his throat. I wanted to scream until the windows shattered. I wanted to tell him he was a monster. But then I stopped. If I confronted him now, he would spin it. He was a master manipulator. He would say he got the date wrong on the story, or that he had looked at the ring months ago and just went to pick it up that morning. He would say the receipt time was wrong. He would call me ungrateful. He would tell me I was hysterical with grief and that I was ruining a beautiful gesture. He would make me the villain. No. I folded the receipt carefully, smoothing the creases with a thumb that had gone white from pressure. I walked over to my own purse, which was sitting on the chair, and tucked the slip of paper deep into the zippered pocket where I kept my emergency cash. I wiped my face. I looked in the mirror on the wall. My eyes were red, but they were dry. The sadness was gone, replaced by a clarity that was sharp as a knife. He called again, closer this time, footsteps on the stairs. I took a deep breath. I needed to act. I needed to give a performance worthy of the one he had given at the graveside. "I'm up here, Mark," I called out, forcing my voice to be steady. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie. He looked at me, scanning my face for signs of the unreasonable grief he so despised. "Looking for the deed," I said. He stiffened slightly, his eyes darting to the desk. "No," I lied. He relaxed visibly. "I probably have it in my briefcase. Come on, let's eat. I'm starving." He chuckled at his own joke. I walked toward him. He expected a hug. He expected the doting fiancé. I stopped in front of him and forced the corners of my mouth up. It felt like cracking plaster. "Chinese food sounds good," I said. He leaned in and kissed me. His lips felt slimy. I didn't pull away. I stood there, letting him think he still owned me. He asked, glancing at my bare hand. You should be wearing it. It's on the nightstand, I said softly. Good girl, he said, patting my arm. We have to take a picture of it with the fortune cookie later. Mark, I said, as he turned to leave the room. When is your birthday? Next Saturday. Why? Yes, I said, and for the first time in 3 days, my smile reached my eyes. It wasn't a nice smile. I'm planning something big. Since you gave me such a public surprise, I think it's only fair I give you one too. A big party, with everyone there. Your family, my family. Mark's eyes lit up. This was what he wanted. Adoration. A crowd. That sounds amazing, Val. I knew you'd bounce back. Oh, I see it, I said, my hand closing over the fabric of my pocket where the receipt lay hidden. Great. He bounded down the stairs, happy as a child. I stayed in the office for a moment longer, listening to him unpack the takeout containers in the kitchen, whistling that same tune. He thought the story was about love. He thought it was a romance, where he was the prince. He had no idea that the genre had just changed. This wasn't a romance anymore. It was a revenge tragedy. And I was writing the final act. I walked over to the window and looked out at the gray, overcast sky. It looked just like the sky at the cemetery. I promise, Mom, I whispered to the glass. He won't get away with this. He wanted an audience? I went downstairs to eat dinner with the man who had bought my engagement ring on clearance while my mother's body was still warm, and I didn't shed a single tear. I put the ring on my finger. It glinted under the harsh kitchen lights. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a shackle anymore. It felt like a grenade. And I was just waiting for the right moment to pull the pin. The General Tso's chicken tasted like ash in my mouth. I sat across from Mark at our small kitchen table, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing overhead, illuminating the grease shining on his chin. He was scrolling through his phone with one hand and forking noodles into his mouth with the other, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting opposite him was plotting his destruction. "Babe, look at this," he said, turning the screen toward me. It was a photo of us at the graveside. He had cropped out the casket, zooming in on his profile as he wiped a tear from my cheek. The caption read, "In the midst of death, we choose life. Honored to be her rock. She said yes. #love, grief, proposal." 200 likes already, he said, a note of pride in his voice. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "It's a beautiful picture, Mark," I lied. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears, but he didn't notice. He never noticed the tone, only the compliance. "Crack open your cookie," he urged, gesturing to the plastic-wrapped fortune cookie on my plate. "Let's see what the future holds for the future." My hands trembled as I tore the plastic. It wasn't excitement. It was a tremor of pure, suppressed rage. I cracked the cookie open. The slip of paper inside was small and generic. "Your patience will be rewarded in time." I stared at it. It felt like a message from the universe. "Patience?" Mark asked, leaning forward. He frowned for a nanosecond, then laughed, dismissing it. "That's deep. Hey, remind me to call the country club in the morning. Mom says we need to finalize the menu for the birthday bash. Since we're turning it into a semi-engagement celebration, we need to upgrade the wine list." "Of course," I said, taking a sip of water to wash down the dryness in my throat. "We can't have house red when we're celebrating such a..." The next 4 days were a masterclass in dissociation. I woke up next to him, I made him coffee, I ironed his shirts, and every single second, I felt like I was living with a stranger who had invaded my home and was wearing the skin of the man I thought I loved. The receipt was burning a hole in my purse, hidden inside a zippered pocket within a zippered pocket, but its presence filled the house. Mark was insufferable. His birthday was approaching, and usually he was low-key. But this year was different. This year, he was the hero of the hour. He was the man who had saved the grieving orphan. He wanted a coronation, not a party. I took over the planning. "Let me handle it," I told him on Thursday night as he was looking at cufflinks online. "You've done so much for me. You handled the funeral." He looked at me with that pitying, condescending affection that made my skin crawl. "Are you sure you're up for it, Val?" "I'm channeling my energy," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I felt the muscle tense and relax. "I want everyone there. Your parents, your brothers, the guys from your firm, my aunts, everyone who saw us at the cemetery." "That's perfect," he said, kissing my hand, the hand wearing the clearance ring. I went into the bathroom and scrubbed my hand with soap until it was red. On Friday, the day before the party, his mother, Linda, called me. "Valentina, darling," her voice was shrill, piercing through the phone speaker. "I just wanted to make sure you ordered the cake from the bakery I told you about." Everything he had been through. I stood in the middle of my living room, looking at my mother's empty armchair, the cushion still indented from where she used to sit and knit. "Yes, Linda," I said, my voice steady. "I ordered the cake." "Good. And listen, I know you're still sensitive," she said, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper. "But try to perk up a bit for tomorrow. Mark has been so worried about your depression. It wears on a man, you know, dealing with a weeping woman." I gripped the phone so hard the plastic case creaked. "Don't worry, Linda. I'm going to be radiant." "That's the spirit. Oh, and make sure he wears the navy suit." I hung up and stared at the wall. They were all the same. A family of vampires feeding on appearances. Linda didn't care that her son had exploited a funeral. She only cared that the suit looked good in the photos. That night, Mark came home late from work. He had gone out for drinks with his colleagues to pregame his birthday. He smelled of scotch and expensive cologne. He shouted from the hallway, "Guess who I ran into? Your cousin Sophia. She's still raving about the ring." I was sitting on the sofa, folding laundry. I picked up one of his white undershirts. "It certainly catches the light," I said. He froze halfway into the room, kicking off his shoes. My heart hammered, but I kept my face smooth. "I mean, it came from you." He relaxed, letting out a breathy laugh. "You're getting poetic on me." He flopped down on the sofa next to me, resting his head on my lap. I went stiff. "Rub my head, will you? I have a headache." I looked down at him. His eyes were closed, his lashes long and dark against his cheeks. He looked innocent. He looked like the man I had dated for 3 years, the man I thought would be the father of my children. It was terrifying how the face of evil could look so mundane. I placed my hands on his temples and began to massage. I had the power to hurt him right then. I could have dug my nails in. I could have screamed the truth into his ear. But I didn't. I needed the audience. The humiliation had to be public to match the scale of his offense. He had stolen my mother's funeral. I was going to steal his life, I whispered. He didn't even open his eyes. The lie came out smooth as butter. "Of course, baby. Back in May. I was just waiting for the right sunset, the right trip. But then, when your mom passed, it just hit me. Why wait?" "Yes," I said, looking at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above us. "Life is fleeting," he mumbled, half asleep. I said, "Time is expensive. Go to bed, Mark." The morning of the party dawned gray and rainy, a mirror of the day we buried my mother. Mark was in high spirits, whistling in the shower. I laid out his navy suit on the bed, smoothing the fabric with mechanical precision. I dressed in the guest room. I chose a dress I had bought years ago but never worn. A sleek, silver silk dress that looked like liquid metal. It was cold, sharp, and armor-like. I pulled my hair back into a severe bun, exposing my face. No hiding today. I applied my makeup with a heavy hand. Sharp eyeliner, blood red lipstick. When I walked into the bedroom, Mark was adjusting his tie in the mirror. He whistled low when he saw me. "Wow," he said, turning around. "You look intense. Hot, but intense." "It's a celebration," I said, walking over to the dresser where I had placed a small velvet box. He raised an eyebrow. "Yes. You're going to give a speech, aren't you? About us?" He grinned, his ego stroking instantly. "Well, I suppose I should say a few words." I picked up the velvet box. It wasn't a ring box. It was larger, meant for a watch. He took the box, his eyes lighting up with greed. "You didn't have to, Val." "Open it later," I said, placing my hand over his. "At the party, when everyone is watching. I want you to open it right after you blow out the candles. It's—" He looked at me, intrigued. "You're being very mysterious." "It's better," I said. We drove to the country club in silence. The rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the world outside. Mark hummed along to the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, the diamond on my finger flashing in his peripheral vision every time I moved my hand. He reached over and squeezed my thigh. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to that serious, fake sincere register he used when he wanted something, "I was thinking, after the wedding, we should sell your mom's house. The market is hot." I stared out the window at the passing strip malls. He was already spending my inheritance. He was already erasing the last physical trace of my mother. "We can talk about that later," I said. "I'm just saying, it makes sense. Too many memories in that old place. You need a fresh start." "A fresh start?" I repeated. "Yes." The country club was decorated in gold and navy. Linda had outdone herself. There were balloons, a jazz trio playing in the corner, and a banner that said, "Happy birthday, Mark, and congratulations on the engagement." The room was full, 200 people, just like I had promised. My aunts were there, still wearing black, looking out of place among Mark's wealthy, colorful friends. Cousin Sophia waved frantically from the bar. Mark's boss was shaking hands near the buffet. Mark worked the room like a politician. He held my hand in a vice grip, dragging me from group to group, accepting congratulations. "She was so brave," he told his college roommate, gesturing to me with his drink, "standing there at the grave, so broken." I knew I had to step in. "You're a saint, Mark," the roommate said, slapping him on the back. "I made a promise to her mother," Mark said, his face solemn. I felt the blood drain from my face. He was adding to the lie. There was no promise. He wasn't even there. "Excuse me," I said, pulling my hand away. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking sharply on the parquet floor. I needed a moment to breathe before I did this. I went into the service hallway and leaned against the cold wall. I closed my eyes and pictured my mother. I pictured her laugh, her warm hands, the way she used to sing while cooking. She hated liars. She hated show-offs. "Do it for her," a voice inside me whispered. "Burn it down." I took the folded receipt out of my purse. I had made a photocopy of it, blown up to letter size, but I kept the original, the thermal paper crinkled and fading. I put the original back in my pocket. The copy was already in the hands of the waiter I had tipped $100. I walked back into the hall. It was time. "Everyone!" Linda was clapping her hands near the head table. The lights dimmed. A massive cake was wheeled out, sparking with candles. Mark stood in the center of the room, beaming. He beckoned me over. He shouted, I walked toward him. The room went quiet, save for the crackling of the sparklers. I stood next to him, the silver dress reflecting the candlelight. I looked like a knife blade. Linda shrieked. Mark closed his eyes. He looked so smug, so assured of his place in the world. He blew out the candles. The room erupted in applause. "Speech!" his brother chanted. Mark held up his hands, feigning modesty. Okay. Thank you all for coming. You know, this year has been a roller coaster. Losing Valentina's mother was a tragedy. A tragedy." He paused for effect. A few of my aunts dabbed their eyes. I knew that love conquers death. He put his arm around me, pulling me tight. The applause started again, but I stepped forward, moving out of his grip. "Mark," I said. My voice was clear, amplified by the silence that fell over the room as they realized I was about to speak. "Oh, right," he looked excited. I signaled to the waiter. He walked over holding a silver tray. On it was the velvet watch box I had given Mark earlier. "Open it," I said. Mark smiled at the crowd. "She spoils me," he joked. He popped the latch on the box and lifted the lid. His smile froze. There was no watch inside. There was only a folded piece of paper. He looked confused. He reached in and took out the paper, unfolding it. It was the original receipt. The thermal paper crinkled in the microphone silence. I saw his eyes scan the lines. I saw the moment the blood left his face. I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. He whispered, his voice trembling, trying to keep the smile, but failing. "Read it," I said. I wasn't whispering. He tried to close the paper, to hide it. "Read the date, Mark," I commanded. I stepped closer to him. "Read the date to your mother." "Valentina, stop," he hissed, his eyes darting around the room. The guests were shifting uncomfortably. The air was thick with tension. "You told everyone you bought the ring 6 months ago," I said, addressing the room now. I turned my back on him. "You told everyone it was a planned, romantic gesture." I turned back to him. He looked small now. The hero suit didn't fit anymore. "But that receipt says October 14th. I let the silence hang. A gasp rippled through the room. I saw Linda's hand fly to her mouth. "You didn't buy it 6 months ago," I continued, my voice rising, fueled by the grief of 1,000 sleepless nights. "You went to the clearance section of the mall while I was crying over her casket. You bought a non-refundable ring because you saw a photo op." Mark shouted, but his voice cracked. "You're crazy!" I reached into my purse and pulled out the printout of the bank transaction I had downloaded that morning. "Here is the charge." I pointed to the screen that had been set up for a slideshow of his childhood photos. I had bribed the AV guy, too. Suddenly, the screen changed. It wasn't Baby Mark. It was a blown-up image of the receipt. "Clearance. Final sale. Oct. 14. The room exploded. People were whispering, pointing. My Aunt Rosa stood up, her face purple with rage. "XG!" she screamed. Mark looked panicked. He looked at his mother for help, but Linda was staring at the screen, horrified. I took the ring off my finger. It felt like pulling a thorn out of my flesh. I held it up. It caught the light one last time, a cold, empty sparkle. I said, stepping into his personal space. He flinched. "You wanted an audience?" I dropped the ring into his glass of champagne. It made a small plink sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot. "Happy birthday," I said. And then I turned around and walked out. I walked past his gaping friends. I walked past his crying mother. I walked past my cousin Sophia, who looked like she wanted to murder him. I walked out of the banquet hall, through the lobby, and out into the rain. I didn't have a coat. The rain soaked my silver dress instantly, plastering it to my skin, but I didn't feel cold. For the first time since my mother took her last breath, I felt warm. I felt clean. I heard the heavy doors of the country club burst open behind me. "Valentina!" Mark's voice was desperate, wet with rain and panic. I didn't stop. He kept walking toward the parking lot, my head held high. He screamed, "In front of my boss!" I stopped at my car door. I turned slowly. He was standing on the steps, his expensive suit soaked, looking like a drowned rat. He looked pathetic. "You did it to yourself, Mark," I called out. I got into my car and locked the doors. As I drove away, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror, he was still standing there, screaming at the rain, a man who had tried to capitalize on death and had been buried by the truth. I drove straight to the cemetery. The gates were open. It was dusk, and the rain had turned to a soft drizzle. I walked to my mother's grave. The dirt was still fresh, mounded high. The flowers from the funeral were gone, replaced by the simple bouquet I had brought 2 days ago. I knelt in the wet grass. My dress was ruined. My makeup was running down my face. I didn't care. "I did it, Mom," I whispered, touching the cold stone of her temporary marker. "I didn't let him win. I'm safe." The wind rustled through the trees, a soft, sighing sound. It felt like an embrace. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the dead far more comforting than the noise of the living. I was alone, truly alone now. No fiancé, no mother. But as I looked at my bare left hand, wiggling my fingers in the rain, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was free. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof of my sedan, a sound that felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. I sat there in the cemetery parking lot for what felt like hours, though the dashboard clock told me it had only been 20 minutes. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the country club doors, that had kept my voice steady and my spine straight while I dismantled my life in front of 200 people, was beginning to drain away. In its place, a bone-deep cold settled in. My silver dress, once a suit of armor, was now just wet silk clinging uncomfortably to my skin, shivering against the leather seat. My phone, tossed onto the passenger seat, lit up again. It vibrated against the upholstery, an angry, persistent buzzing. Mark. I stared at the screen. 7 missed calls. 12 text messages. I didn't touch it. I just watched his name flash and fade, flash and fade. The man who had held me while I wept, the man who had bought me soup and checked my tire pressure, was the same man who had calculated the ROI on my grief. The duality of it made me nauseous. I shifted the car into gear, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't go home. That house, with its live, laugh, love signs he insisted on, and the leather sectional he loved, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene of emotional fraud. There was only one place to go. I drove through the slick, dark streets, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Every red light was a blurry halo of color. I navigated by muscle memory, turning away from the upscale suburbs where Mark and I lived and heading toward the older, tree-lined streets of the east side. The houses here were smaller, closer together, worn at the edges, but filled with life. I pulled into the driveway of a brick bungalow with a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Before I could even cut the engine, the front door flew open. Aunt Rosa stood there, framed by the warm yellow light of the hallway. She was still wearing her black funeral dress, a shawl thrown over her shoulders. She didn't wait for me to get out. She marched down the steps in her house slippers, ignoring the rain, and yanked my car door open. "Get inside," she commanded, her voice thick with emotion. I stepped out, and my legs finally gave way. I didn't fall, because Rosa was there. She was a foot shorter than me, but she had the strength of a woman who had buried a husband and raised 4 children alone. She caught me, wrapping her arms around my soaked waist, pulling me into the softness of her shawl. She smelled of lavender laundry detergent and garlic, the smell of safety. "I did it, Tia," I sobbed into her shoulder, the tears finally mixing with the rain. "I know, mija, I know," she murmured, stroking my wet hair as she guided me up the steps. "You did good. You were strong. Your mother—" Inside, the house was a sensory overload of warmth. The radiator clanked in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of simmering broth. My cousin Sophia was there, sitting at the kitchen table, still in her formal wear, aggressively typing on her phone. She looked up as we entered, her eyes wide. Sophia jumped up, a napkin in her hand. "You are a legend!" "I don't feel like a legend," I said, my teeth chattering as Rosa peeled the wet silk from my shoulders. "Sit," Rosa ordered, pushing me onto a wooden chair and throwing a heavy wool blanket over me. "Sophia, get the brandy." "You need to see this, though," Sophia said, ignoring her mother and shoving her phone in my face. "Look at the group chat. Look at Facebook. She's distancing herself, Val." I looked at the screen through blurry eyes. Comments were rolling in on the photo Mark had posted earlier, the one of us at the grave. Despicable. Unfollowed. I was at the party. I saw the receipt. This guy is a monster. "Stop it," I whispered, pushing the phone away. "I don't want to see it." "It's justice," Sophia said fiercely, pouring a generous amount of amber liquid into a glass. "He thought he could use our family tragedy for his little influencer career?" Rosa set a steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of me, my mother's recipe. The smell hit me hard, a punch to the gut that brought fresh tears. It smelled like Sunday afternoons. It smelled like the life I had lost 2 weeks ago. "Drink," Rosa said, sitting opposite me and taking my freezing hands in hers. Her palms were rough and warm. "Forget him for a minute." I looked into her dark eyes, eyes that mirrored my mother's. "He is a small man," Rosa said firmly. "And you are a big woman with a big heart. He saw a broken girl he could mold." "I loved him, Tia," I confessed, the words tasting like ash. "That's the worst part. Even when I found the receipt, a part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it. I wanted to just go back to being the girl who was getting married." "That is not weakness, Valentina," Rosa said, squeezing my hands until it hurt. "That is human. We all want to be saved, especially when we lose our mama. We feel like little children again, scared of the dark." My phone buzzed again on the table. Sophia snatched it up before I could look. "It's him again," she said, reading the screen with a scowl. "Valentina, please let me explain. The liar doesn't even know when to quit." "Block him," I said, my voice barely audible. Sophia looked at me. "Block him," I repeated, louder this time, finding a scrap of strength in the soup and the brandy. "Block his number, block his mother, block his brothers. I don't want to hear them." Sophia grinned, a vicious, satisfied expression. She tapped the screen with emphasis. "Blocked, blocked, and blocked." A silence settled over the kitchen, broken only by the rain and the clinking of my spoon against the ceramic bowl. I took a sip of the soup. It was hot, salty, and perfect. It warmed my chest, loosening the knot of anxiety that had been there for days. "I live with him. My clothes are there." The mention of the urn made Rosa cross herself. "We will go tomorrow," she declared. "Me, Sophia, and your uncles. We will go with a truck. We will get your things and we will get your mother." "He's going to be angry," I said, a shiver of fear running down my spine. "He cares about his image more than anything." "He humiliated himself," Rosa corrected sharply. "You just handed him the mirror. And if he says one word to you, one single word, your Uncle Mateo will handle it. Mark is a corporate boy." I let out a weak, watery laugh. It felt strange to laugh. "I ruined the cake," I said, remembering the beautiful chocolate cake Linda had made me order. "To hell with the cake," Sophia said, reaching into the pantry. She pulled out a box of grocery store donuts. Powdered sugar, cheap and stale. She slammed them on the table. "We have donuts." I took a donut. The powdered sugar got everywhere, dusting the wool blanket, falling onto the table. I took a bite. It was dry and overly sweet, and it was the best thing I had ever tasted. "I miss her, Tia," I whispered, the food turning to a lump in my throat. "I miss Mom so much. I wanted to tell her. When I found the receipt in his jacket pocket, my first instinct was to call her." Rosa's face crumpled. She stood up and came around the table, pulling my head against her chest. I could hear her heart beating, strong and steady. "I know," she soothed, rocking me back and forth like a baby. "I reached for the phone yesterday to tell her about the rain. It takes a long time to stop reaching, mija." "She never liked him," I mumbled into her apron. She never said it, but I knew. "Mothers know," Rosa said. "She is resting easier tonight, Valentina. You cleared the weeds from her grave." Later that night, I lay in the guest bed, wearing one of Sophia's oversized t-shirts. The house was quiet, but I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, dripping silence outside. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the look on Mark's face when I pulled out the receipt. The panic. The way his charm simply evaporated, leaving behind a scared, greedy child. I had loved a phantom. For 3 years, I had poured my heart into a container that had no bottom. I rolled over and curled into a ball, pulling the quilt up to my chin. My finger felt light, phantom heavy where the ring used to be. I rubbed the spot with my thumb. The skin was still indented, a pale band of flesh where the diamond had blocked the sun. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my future. Yesterday, my future was a wedding in June, a house in the hills, and a life of managing Mark's ego. Today, my future was a blank slate. It was terrifying. It was dark. But as I drifted off, listening to the old house settle around me, I realized something. It was my darkness. It wasn't curated, it wasn't filtered, it was mine to navigate, mine to fill. "Good night, Mom," I whispered into the dark room. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of falling. The morning sun didn't ask for permission. It sliced through the thin curtains of Aunt Rosa's guest room, landing squarely on my face, warm and insistent. I blinked, my eyelids feeling heavy and swollen, the crust of dried tears clinging to my lashes. For a split second, I didn't know where I was. The floral wallpaper was peeling slightly at the corner, and the smell of frying chorizo and strong coffee was thick in the air. It wasn't the sanitized vanilla candle scent of the house in the hills. It was the smell of home. Then the memory of the night before came rushing back like a physical blow to the chest. The country club. The microphone. The receipt. The look of absolute horror on Linda's face as the truth was projected onto the screen. I sat up, clutching the quilt to my chest. My heart gave a painful thud. I had blown up my life. I was 25 years old, orphaned, single, and homeless, all within the span of 2 weeks. The door creaked open. Aunt Rosa stood there, already dressed in her Sunday best, though it was a Tuesday. She held a mug of coffee in one hand and a black trash bag in the other. "Drink," she said, setting the mug on the bedside table. "Then get dressed. The boys are outside. We are going to get your mother." She said, "Your mother." She knew exactly where my heart was bleeding. I drank the coffee black. It was bitter and scalded my tongue, waking me up. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a sweater Sophia had left for me. I looked in the mirror above the dresser. I looked tired. I looked pale. But the haunted, desperate look that had been in my eyes for the last 6 months, the look of a woman trying to be perfect for a man who demanded perfection, was gone. In its place was something harder, something like flint. When I walked out to the front porch, I stopped. It wasn't just Aunt Rosa and Sophia. My Uncle Mateo was leaning against his beat-up Ford pickup truck. My cousins, Gabriel and Leo, were sitting on the tailgate. They were big men who worked with their hands, men who didn't know about stock markets or country clubs, but knew how to fix a leaky roof and how to protect their own. Uncle Mateo flicked his cigarette into the wet grass when he saw me. He didn't smile, he just nodded. "Ready, mija?" he asked. His voice was gravel. I nodded, unable to speak. I climbed into the cab of the truck between Rosa and Mateo. We drove in silence, a caravan of rusted justice heading toward the wealthy hills. As we wound our way up the canyon roads, the houses got bigger, the gates taller, the lawns greener. It felt like driving into a different country. We pulled up to the house Mark and I had shared. It was a modern glass and steel box that he loved and I tolerated. It looked cold. There was a silver Mercedes in the driveway. Linda. My stomach clenched. I didn't want to see her. I didn't want to see him. "Stay close to me," Rosa whispered, squeezing my knee. We got out. Uncle Mateo didn't knock. He had the spare key I had given him for emergencies. He unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open. The house was silent, but it felt like the air was vibrating with tension. We walked into the open-plan living room. Mark was sitting on the white leather sofa, his head in his hands. He was still wearing his suit pants from the night before, though the shirt was unbuttoned and stained. Linda was pacing the floor, talking furiously into her cell phone. They both froze when they saw us. Mark looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face splotchy. When he saw me, he stood up, swaying slightly. "Val," he crooned, his voice cracking. "Val, thank God. I knew you'd come back. We need to talk. We need to do damage control. My boss is asking questions." He took a step toward me. Uncle Mateo took a step forward. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, a solid wall of muscle and unresolved grief. Mark stopped dead in his tracks. "Who are these people?" Linda snapped, snapping her phone shut. "Valentina, this is highly inappropriate. You can't just bring a gang into my son's home." "This is my family," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "And we're not here to talk. We're here for my things." Mark looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the desperation kick in. The charm was gone, replaced by a frantic need to control the narrative. "Valentina, please," he begged, holding his hands out. "You're overreacting. The receipt. I can explain. It was a joke, a bad joke. I bought the ring months ago, I swear. That receipt was for earrings." I stared at him. Even now, with his world burning down, he was lying. He couldn't help it. It was woven into his DNA. "Stop it, Mark," I said, walking past him. "Just stop." I headed for the stairs. Aunt Rosa and Sophia followed me. I heard Mark start to follow, but Gabriel and Leo stepped into his path. I didn't look back, but I heard the silence that fell downstairs. I went into the master bedroom. It smelled like his cologne, sandalwood and arrogance. I grabbed the suitcase from the closet and threw it open on the bed. I didn't pack everything. I left the shoes that pinched my toes. I left the jewelry he had given me for anniversaries, cold stones that meant nothing. I packed my jeans, my old sweaters, the books my mother had given me, the photo albums. Then I went to the shelf in the corner. There it was, the mahogany urn. I reached out and touched the cool wood. My breath hitched. I felt like I was rescuing her from a hostage situation. I picked it up, cradling it against my chest. "I've got you, Mom," I whispered. "Let's get out of here." Sophia was sweeping the bathroom, throwing my toiletries into a bag. Rosa was stripping the bed, not because I needed the sheets, but because she was angry. "Leave it, Tia," I said. "I don't want the sheets. I don't want anything that touched him." We walked back downstairs. The living room was a tableau of class warfare. Mark was sitting back on the couch, looking defeated. Linda was standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disdain. "You're making a mistake, Valentina," Linda said as I reached the bottom step. "Mark is a good man. He made a mistake. You're throwing away a secure future. Do you know how hard it is out there?" I looked at the woman who had planned my wedding menu without asking me what I liked to eat. I looked at the woman who had told me not to cry too loud at the funeral because it made people uncomfortable. "I have a job, Linda," I said. "I have a degree, and I have a family who loves me for me, not for how I look in a photo." Mark looked up at me. His eyes landed on the urn in my arms. "You're taking the ashes?" he asked, his voice dull. "Yes," I said. "But that was part of the plan," he muttered, almost to himself. "We were going to scatter them in Hawaii, on the honeymoon. It would have been beautiful content." The air left the room. Sophia gasped. Aunt Rosa made a sound like a growling cat. "Content," I repeated. The word tasted like poison. "You wanted to use my mother's remains." Mark realized his mistake too late. "No, I mean, for memories. Val, I love you." I walked up to him. I stood over him, holding my mother tight. "You don't love me, Mark," I said. "You love the idea of me. You love having a tragedy to save. But the tragedy is over. I'm not the sad little orphan anymore." I turned to my uncle. "Let's go." We walked out. I didn't look back. But as I stepped onto the driveway, Linda came running out. "Wait," she hissed, grabbing my arm. I flinched, pulling away. "The ring," she demanded, her eyes cold and hard. "The diamond. It cost $15,000. Where is it?" I looked at her manicured nails. I remembered the sound of the ring hitting the bottom of the champagne flute. "Ask the dishwasher at the country club," I said. "Or maybe Mark drank it. I don't know. It's not my problem." Her mouth fell open. "You little—" "Linda," I cut her off. "My mother died 2 weeks ago. Your son used her funeral to go shopping for a prop. If you say one more word to me, I will go to the press. I have the receipt. I have the bank statements. I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what the Thompson family is made of." She went pale. She took a step back, her hand fluttering to her pearl necklace. I turned and climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life. As we pulled away, I watched through the side mirror. Mark had come out to the porch. He looked small. He looked like a paper doll that had been left out in the rain. I rolled down the window. The air was fresh as we drove down the hill, leaving the gated community behind. Uncle Mateo reached over and turned on the radio. Old school salsa filled the cab. He patted my hand. "You did good, Valentina," he said. I looked down at the urn in my lap. I traced the grain of the wood. We arrived back at the bungalow on the east side. It wasn't grand. The paint was chipping on the porch railing. The lawn was patchy. But as I walked up the steps, carrying my mother, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. We set the urn on a mantelpiece in the living room, right next to the photo of my father and the statue of the Virgin Mary. Aunt Rosa lit a candle. "She is home," Rosa said, crossing herself. I sat on the worn velvet sofa. The house was full of noise now. Cousins laughing in the kitchen, the TV playing the news, the sound of life. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from Instagram. Mark Thompson has deleted his account. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I went to my gallery. I selected every photo of Mark, the one from our first date, the one from Christmas, the one from the funeral where he was looking at the camera instead of the grave. Select all. Delete. Are you sure you want to permanently delete 452 items? My thumb hovered over the button. 2 years of my life. 2 years of trying to fit into a mold that was too small for me. I pressed yes. The screen cleared. Sophia came into the room with a plate of tacos. "Eat," she said. "You look like a skeleton." I took a taco. I took a bite. It was spicy and hot and real. I looked at the mantelpiece. The candle flame flickered, dancing in the draft from the window. It looked like a wink. I'm 25 years old, I thought. I have no fiancé. I have no ring. I have no plan. But I looked around the room at the people who had dropped everything to drive a truck into the hills for me. I looked at the urn that held the woman who had taught me how to walk, how to read, how to survive. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of home. I have everything I need.